All right. I can assure you that I won't be as funny. But that was amazing. It really was. I want to first thank the ACS family for allowing me to present this award tonight, because in many ways it feels as if I'm accepting this award. It is truly a privilege and an honor again to present the ACS Progressive Champion Award to our next honoree. This award recognizes extraordinary efforts to ensure that the law is a force to improve the lives of all people, protect our Constitution, and cultivate the next generation of legal leaders. And that definition defines Steve. For over 35 years, Steve Bright has worked diligently and tirelessly at the Southern Center for Human Rights. There, he's provided adequate representation to the indigent, the powerless, and oftentimes those who are forgotten. I first became aware of Steve and his work in 2002. After seeing him on C-SPAN, he was testifying against the use of the death penalty in America. Now, this testimony took on an entirely different meaning for me because I was watching it from a maximum security prison 3 years into a 28-year sentence for a crime that I did not commit. Seeing that fiery passion, it encouraged me. It encouraged me to continue to fight and to prove my own innocence. And after nearly a decade in prison, with the help of the Wisconsin Innocence Project, give it up for him, please do. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals unanimously overturned my conviction, and I was released in February of 2007 after the prosecutor dismissed all charges against me. My next encounter with Steve would be right in the flesh, here at the ACS convention in 2015. By that time, I had been released in 2007. I immediately got to work and went to school. I graduated with my associate's degree in 2009. In 2012, my bachelor's degree, and my law degree in 2015. I was invited to the convention that year because I was, just getting out here, so to speak. Just been in school for 10 years just to get back to this point. And I was invited to the convention, and it was on the eve of me getting ready to start a judicial law fellowship in the very same Seventh Circuit that overturned my conviction. After Steve was finishing up a panel, I eagerly approached him, and I wanted to tell him my story. And it shocked me because he actually stopped. He stopped and he took the time to listen to me. And I totally forgot what I wanted to tell him at all. So I was eventually able to gather myself and I shared my story with him. It was just hours before his keynote at the convention that year. And somehow, Steve was able to incorporate my story in his remarks. And he acknowledged me in front of the entire room. And that meant a lot because it told me that he wasn't just a legend that I saw on TV or he wasn't just putting on an act. This was Steve. This was Steve. I walked away from that night and I said to myself, I want to be just like Steve. And then a little while later, I read an article that said he only made $38,000 a year. And I reconsidered. Now, but seriously, all joking aside, look, Steve decided that he wasn't doing this work to become wealthy. He wanted to become rich. And he wanted to become rich in the number of lives that he positively affected each and every day. Now, I know you're announcing your retirement. Well, that's the rumor, okay? But I'll say this. So did Michael Jordan. So did Brett Favre. And a number of other greats who still had that itch to scratch again. Steve, if you ever feel a need, the ACS family will help you scratch those hard-to-reach areas with open arms. I'll close with this. I'll close with this. Steve, you recently quoted the late, great Thurgood Marshall saying that while you were at the center, you did the best you could have with what you did have. I slightly disagree, and I know that everyone in this room would agree with me in saying you did better than most would have with what you did have. I'm asking you now to join me on the stage in accepting the Progressive Champion Award. This award means so much for me to be able to present it to you.
Great. You're great. You're great.
Thank you. You're great. I really appreciate that.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Don't drop that thing, all right?
I tell you what, put it back. I will. All right, how about that? I can't believe that the American Constitution Society people had me speak after Becca Heller. I'm never going to let that happen again, I'll tell you that. I also want to tell you that the death penalty is not nearly as funny as stopping the President of the United States from his ban on getting people in. But I'm going to do the best I can with it. First of all, let me say this. I'm grateful for this. It really is not me. It's the Southern Center for Human Rights. For the last 35 years, I've had the privilege of working with the most gifted lawyers, some of the most gifted lawyers in this country. Willing to work not only for 38, but a lot of people work for less than 38. You know, at one time, my salary was 16. And I was saying, Brian Stevenson and I were living together in an apartment, two rooms, basically. And I said, now, we're real poverty lawyers. Everybody we're dealing with is in poverty. In fact, they're all locked up. So we got to go see them at prisons and jails and so forth. And we were living in poverty. And we had sort of, it was a little rough start there at the Southern Center for Human Rights not long after I came. I always tell the law students this. I know Justice Breyer said, do something in the public interest. And I know that when you get out of law school or when you're a young lawyer, there's a lot of competition for jobs. But I always remind people that one way to get a job is to go for the job that nobody wants. That's what I did. I went to an organization that nobody in their right mind would go there because it was financially bankrupt. It had several death penalty and prison condition cases, all in various states of disarray. And anybody in their right mind would say, fold this thing up and end it. But Bob Moran, now the Chief Judge of your Superior Court here in D.C., and I headed south. We got this little organization going. I'll tell you, at the start, I remember one of our first big contributions was a car given to us by the homeless shelter there in town. Now, you know, you're sort of at the bottom of the philanthropic food chain when you're getting donations from the homeless shelter. But I'm going to tell you that that car, Plymouth Duster, that car probably had more miles on it than any car in the history of automobiles. We'll never know for sure because the odometer didn't work. But I feel pretty sure that was the case. But we have had a lot of gifted people over the years since that time. That was 1982, September. And I have always tried to do what I think's wise, hire people that are smarter than you are, and let them sort of, you know, carry you along. And that's what I've done. Sarah Tatanchi is here, our director. I hired Sarah Tatanchi. Stand up. So maybe a little bit of this award is for good judgment, because I hired Sarah to be our public policy person, and she's now our director. She runs the Southern Center. Maureen Del Duca is here, who's the chair of our board. And my goodness, have we ever benefited from the tremendous amount of leadership and energy and direction and so many things that Maureen has provided for us. So this acknowledges that in years, 35 years, a lot of people. In fact, I was talking to the Attorney General, who will address us in just a minute. One of the lawyers who was in my first class, my very first class at Yale Law School, Robin Toone, came and worked for me for a number of years, about 8 or 10 years after that, and is now the head of one of the divisions in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. So, but before he went to join Maura Healey, he did a lot of tremendous work in our office, argued some cases en banc right out of law school at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, particularly one involving prisoners who had been tortured at one of the prisons in Georgia. The other thing, I think, is this recognizes those people who, Becca said, the people who are at the bottom are those who represent and stand with those who are at the bottom of a deep, dark hole. That is, the people that are absolutely on the margins of society. People like my friend Chris Phillips, who was barely making it on the margins of society. He had a little job at a liquor store. He had a little room he rented, but he got arrested and he got held 2 weeks, just 2 weeks, and they let him go. Never went for a judge, never saw a lawyer, but he lost his apartment, or his room, it wasn't really an apartment, and he lost his job, and he became a homeless person. He was schizophrenic. He had a hard time coping with the world. As it was, and yet here the criminal courts had just shoved him off a decent living with a place to live and so forth. We see so many examples of that. I often say, I just can't believe we're going to see anything any worse than all these things we've seen. People like Adele Edwards, who was a man with an IQ of about 50, who lived in a tar paper shack and no money whatsoever, income except for food stamps, and he was fined $500 for burning leaves without a license. That's on his own front yard. He was burning leaves and didn't check the code there, I guess, and realized that this was against the law. He was fined $500. He didn't have any money, so they took him into custody. This is something we've been fighting for years now, debtor prisons. People who don't have the money, who shouldn't be fined at all, but who are fined and then are put on some sort of installment plan where you pay so much a month of the fine that you owe, but also $40 a month to the private probation company that's making a fortune. It's the most disgusting thing. Here are these extraordinarily wealthy people getting rich off the absolutely most destitute people in our society. And one thing we can never stop doing, Vanita, I think is still here, Vanita Gupta, I've commended her so many times on the report that they did on Ferguson and on the courts there, because they talked about these courts are not about law enforcement. These courts are not about making the communities a better place to live. They're not about enforcing the laws. They're revenue generating. We have a little town in Georgia, Warwick. Probably haven't heard of it. It only has 500 people. $1.2 million in fines last year in their traffic court. These are not courts of justice. These are courts of profit. And when courts are courts of profit, they are never going to be courts of justice. And but as I said, no matter how bad these things we see like that, and we see them in the death penalty cases, and we see them at the top of the system with the death penalty cases, and we see them Adele Edwards in that kind of situation. But the other day, Sarah Garrity was telling me about yet another client that we had, Cleopatra Harrison, a woman who had complained at one time about a domestic situation. Her boyfriend was arrested, but she decided to drop the charges. The court fined her for dropping the charges, fined her $150. She couldn't pay $150, so they threw her in jail for not being able to pay the fine, being a victim in the court. Now that's sort of a new low, in my opinion, in terms of that she and other victims of domestic violence were being fined when they dropped the charges, because the judge was saying, well, we had to send cops out to arrest and we had to do all these things, so you've got to pay for that. And the death penalty, I can report that things are a lot better than they were a long time ago. Last year, in the entire United States of America, with all the size of this country and the number of crimes we have, only 30 people were sentenced to death in courtrooms across this country. In the 1990s, it was over 300 people were being sentenced to death. That's a tremendous drop. And it started in the 1900s and got down below 100 finally once we got over in the year 2000, and has been going down every year consistently. But at the same time, there's a man scheduled to be executed who will be executed in Alabama tonight. There are still cases that we see of lawyers who are sleeping during death penalty trials. There was a trial in Alabama in December, which there were 2 lawyers, and both lawyers slept, but as someone pointed out, they didn't sleep at the same time. One slept through one part of the trial, one slept through another. This passes for justice in this country, that if you've got one lawyer who's awake in a 2-lawyer case, then you don't have a violation of the right to counsel. And it's just a disgrace that this many years after the right to counsel that we tolerate this sort of thing in the courts. We still have lawyers who miss deadlines. We have lawyers who miss deadlines so that federal papers are never filed in capital cases. I'm talking about death penalty cases where lawyers are not filing within the statute of limitations and the clients are getting executed without any review at all by a federal court. And we're kind of dependent on these federal courts because, they have life tenure. And the elected judges that we have are more responsive, of course, to the electorate than they are to the Constitution of the United States. As one judge told me one time in my career, he said, well, in all my years on the bench, the Supreme Court has reversed me one time. He said, I reverse them every day. And so we're fairly dependent upon getting into federal court. So I just think the other people, the people like the Arch City Defenders, who are doing such great work in St. Louis. So many other public interest organizations like that, legal aid programs struggling now with their funding in jeopardy, but helping people that are right down to like being evicted from their home, being deprived of their children. I mean, the most fundamental kinds of things. Public defender offices, all of these things where, as Learned Hand said, it's the daily, it's the small, it's the cumulative injuries of little people that we must protect. Because if we're going to keep this democracy, there's got to be the commandment, thou shalt not ration justice. Thank you.